Following the most tragic events is the painful but necessary process of coping with these events. Repeatedly, these processes demonstrate the importance of an accurate historical memory in the wake of affliction. Historical memory is often described as the collective memories of a group of past events and how those memories are transmitted to future generations. The Guatemalan Civil War and its aftermath provide a strong case study into the concept of historical memory. As the country coped with its loss and the persistence of centuries-old social tensions, it became evident that a nuanced historical perspective was necessary. And while clear themes emerged during the Civil War, the range of experiences is too complex to be simplified in the dichotomy that is often used. To talk about the role of historical memory in Guatemala, I first need to give some context on the social, political, and economic tensions which were the focus of the Civil War and which are still relevant today. While most of the social and economic hierarchy found in Guatemala stems from its colonial experience, it is also essential to realize thousands of years of history of Mayans in Guatemala. There are 23 distinct Mayan groups, and it is false to consider them as a unified population. Guatemala was a colony of Spain for 300 years, and the colonial structures put in place established the economic and social inferiority of the indigenous. The colonizers oppressed the Mayans through systems of forced labor and abusive conditions, thoroughly establishing racist attitudes toward the Mayans. These racial stereotypes were one of the main reasons that the war turned to genocide. In fact, the Commission for Historical Clarification determined that the racism of the state was a factor in the military strategy and actions. The root of these issues was the structural subjugation of the Mayans in the colonial system. After independence, this colonial model continued with the influence of the United Fruit Company. United Fruit racked up profit while abusing indigenous workers. Government concessions to the company effectively made Guatemala the colony of a foreign business. Then, after a period of democratic rule from 1944 to 54, the democratically elected president was ousted in a US-led coup. This action had widespread political consequences and was one of the primary causes of the war. The coup was triggered in response to a progressive land reform policy, which led to fears of socialism by the US government and conservatives within Guatemala. Therefore, the primary conflict was political between military dictatorships and leftist insurgents. However, the strategies employed by both sides exposed the social tensions of the country and made the conflict so brutal and painful. I'm going to highlight a few of the aspects of the Civil War which show the value of a collective memory, which is less likely to misrepresent the truth than a single narrative, and is more useful as a tool for reconciliation. Many aspects of the war have been misrepresented, whether deliberately or not, which historical memory can hopefully correct. First, the military's counterterrorism strategy was specifically tuned to target civilians.
In reality, the subversives need the support of the population. There is a principle of Mao Zedong where he says that water is to the fish what the people are to the gorilla. The fish without water dies. The gorilla without the people dies.
That was General Gordillo in 1982 describing the military's tactics, namely to kill the insurgents by killing the civilians they relied upon. Military records show their advanced knowledge of the rebel operations, and that the insurgents posed no real threat to the military. Despite this, the military exaggerated the threat of the guerrillas in an attempt to justify their scorched earth campaign of terror. The war resulted in the deaths or disappearances of over 200,000 civilians. Of these, 83% of the victims were Mayan, and over 93% of the killings were done by the Guatemalan military itself. The military's own records document the complete destruction of over 440 rural villages. Without a doubt, the pervasive racism of military leaders allowed them to label all Mayans as subversives and for the evolution of a counterterrorism operation into a genocide. The military's actions polarized many Guatemalans, and the suffering that they caused is the primary obstacle that the country has faced when addressing the war. At the same time, the conflict is further complicated by the fact that many of the soldiers were indigenous boys and men who were forcibly recruited into the army into civil defense patrols, or PACs. Some reports estimate that the army conscripted up to 100,000 young men. They were expected to turn in anyone who they believed did not support the military, forcing communities to turn against themselves. These PACs functioned as a paramilitary force, taking orders from the army. The indigenous soldiers in the PACs did not control the military's actions. However, as low-level soldiers, they were the ones committing many of these horrible crimes. This situation defines a simple oppressor and oppressed characterization, as many people committing acts of violence against indigenous people were indigenous themselves. Further, because they were forced into service, many soldiers actually felt reduced responsibility for their actions and even saw themselves as victims. This dynamic is particularly difficult to reconcile, as PAC members see themselves as victims, even as others view them as the perpetrators of violence and the cause of the social and physical destruction of indigenous communities. Since the end of the Civil War, these communities have had to come to terms with this past so that they can rebuild. The guerrillas also bear some responsibility for the human rights abuses in Guatemala, although at a lesser extent in the military. The Commission for Historical Clarification attributed 3% of the human rights violations to the guerrillas, substantially less than the military, but still significant. There are also issues with the common portrayal of the guerrillas as a sort of army for the people. The guerrillas focused on accumulating military power over the development of social systems for the people. Insurgent leaders often dismissed nonviolent attempts at political change and distrusted people who tried to maintain their distance from the guerrillas as possible government sympathizers. Further, on multiple occasions, the guerrillas retreated from villages which immediately afterward became sites of massacres by the army. The insurgents were too small in number and resources to provide the kind of security that they promised to villagers against the military. These massacres were clearly the fault of the army, but the inability of the guerrillas to protect the people led to significant disillusionment with the rebel cause. Finally, propaganda by both the military and the guerrillas misrepresented the indigenous people as a homogeneous political group, either supporting or benefiting from the insurgents. These extremes don't accurately express the more moderate spectrum of most civilians. Really, many people just wanted to live their life peacefully and be left alone from the conflict. The societal repression that they faced led them to oppose the authoritarian regimes that replaced the democratically elected government, but their goals still may not have aligned with those of the guerrillas. Mainly, they would have preferred peaceful opposition rather than the guerrillas' violence. During the most violent parts of the war, most of the guerrillas were indigenous, but it would be difficult to say that most indigenous people directly supported the guerrillas. Those civilians who attempted neutrality still faced persecution as the government and the guerrillas caught them in the middle of a bloody dispute. Because of the level of violence experienced, the trust between the military and civilians disintegrated. At this point, a productive conversation could not occur between groups so diametrically opposed. It is the job of historical memory, a collective catharsis, to help normalize tensions between the various groups of people in Guatemala. It is okay for this process to place blame on the appropriate actors, so long as the ultimate goal is the improvement and healing of the country. Following the peace accords in 1996, a number of programs and organizations have worked to create and preserve the historical memory of the Civil War. The United Nations issued the Commission for Historical Clarification report in 1999. Further projects were taken on by the Catholic Church and by the Guatemalan Human Rights Commission. These resources provided Guatemalans, and especially women, an avenue to share their story for the good of the nation. Many of these documents have contributed to the criminal proceedings against the military. For example, former General Efrain Rios Montt, who was initially convicted of genocide in 2013, but the conviction was later annulled. These collections have also benefited the daily lives of the Guatemalan people as they look to overcome the racial, economic, and political tensions which, while improving, are still strained. Organizations and commissions such as these have given voice to people in Guatemala who historically have not had one. This process of historical memory strives to avoid what author Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of a single story. Giving the people of Guatemala a voice to express their experiences in the Civil War creates a basis of understanding to hopefully help the country work on addressing the issues that divide it. These tensions clearly still trouble Guatemala. However, the existence of an official historical memory, one that is not dominated by political bias, has been essential as the country reconciles its past and looks towards its future. Thank you.